So I think we can start now. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us. This is a panel on cities and illicit economies. Our aim today is to have a broad conversation on the problems that uniquely plague cities when it comes to illicit economies, organized crime, and armed violence more generally. And it's partially inspired by the growing attention and research that has been done on urban violence in its various formats over the past decade or so, driven in part by global urbanization trends and also by the unfortunately continued relevance of the topic in so many cities and towns around the world. And for us at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime, the topic is of great relevance, as cities, of course, serve both as sites of armed violence and as hubs for national and transnational illicit flows. And that is why we started earlier this year a research stream dedicated to understanding the criminal and policy challenges specific to the spatial politics, governance, and security dynamics of urban areas. So if you're interested, look us up on the Global Initiative webpage or on Google as Cities and Illicit Economies. And we're also happy to partner today with the Urban Violence Research Network for this panel. The network connects a global cohort of researchers, public sector, and civil society professionals working on urban violence. So each speaker will talk about the topic of focus or experience in this area for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we hope to have time for some questions and answers. So please send us questions that you may have during the panel via the Q&A function. So I will very briefly introduce our speakers today. We had a last-minute issue with one of the speakers, or more accurately, he had a last-minute unforeseen personal issue, Santiago Tobon. So we are unfortunately we won't have Santiago, but we have another speaker that I will mention very shortly. So we'll start with Emma Elfverson, who is an associate senior lecturer at Uppsala University in Sweden. She conducts research on ethnic politics, communal conflict, urban dimensions of organized violence, and post-conflict cities. Then we'll have Joana Monteiro, who is professor at the Getúlio Vargas Foundation in Rio de Janeiro and a former director of the Public Security Institute of the Rio de Janeiro state government. We'll then move to Andrea Varsori, who very kindly agreed to step in to provide some remarks today. He's a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Huddersfield in the UK, and he's also a coordinator at the Urban Violence Research Network. And finally, we have Martin Bisp, who is the founder and CEO of Empire Fighting Chance, which is an award-winning charity working with vulnerable young people across the UK. So with that, we will start the discussions now, the initial remarks, and as I've told our speakers, each will speak for about 10 to 12 minutes, and then we can have a good virtual discussion. Thank you. So Emma, please.
All right, thank you, Antonio. Just a second while I share my screen. All right, it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. As Antonio just mentioned, I am a political scientist in Uppsala. And together with my colleague Ivan Gusic, I lead a large project on post-war violence in cities. And in my presentation today, I wanted to address the question of why we often see high levels of violence in cities after war and the connections between political and criminal violence in this context. So the entry point for my research and for this talk is that it is by now sort of an established fact that the end of civil war through negotiated agreements, through stalemate, or through the victory of one side over the other rarely entails an end to violence. And in addition, recent research has highlighted that post-war violence often disproportionately affects cities. So why is that? Well, one first sort of general explanation offered in the literature is that cities offer a mobilization advantage due to a combination of urban density, permeability, so the ability to sort of move around and organize and meet in the city through urban infrastructure and public space, and the frequent presence of group-based grievances in the city. A second important reason is that urban density also means that groups cannot fully avoid each other. So instead, people who were on different sides in the war have to live as intimate enemies, in the words of Scott Bollens, increasing the risk of violent encounters. And these risks then are further exacerbated in situations where macro conflicts become intertwined with urban micro struggles. So take the case of Jerusalem, where the broader political conflict between Israel and Palestine intersects with more localized conflicts over specific sites in the Holy City or access to different parts of the city. Or take the example of Mitrovica, where conflicts over the right to cross a certain bridge become intertwined with the broader conflict over Kosovo's existence and status. Post-war cities also tend to attract unintegrated former fighters who find opportunities in urban centers which offer a combination of anonymity and possibilities for making a living. Cities, not least in post-war contexts, concentrate economic and commercial opportunities, which may attract criminal networks as well as generate new political conflicts over economic resources. And finally, post-war cities often remain contested. So although the war has ended, there usually remains unresolved conflicts between previously warring antagonists who hold competing visions of what the post-war situation should look like, and therefore pursue different post-war orders. And such continued contestation often plays out, in particular then in cities. So in my project, we collect data on incidents of conflict-related violence in post-war cities, and we focus on physical violence leading to deaths or serious injuries. So we're not kind of focusing on more everyday forms of violence or structural violence, which also tends to be quite high in post-war cities, but more narrowly focusing on this type of sort of most public, visible violence. And so far, we covered 20 cities across the world from contexts where the war has ended at some point after 1989. So this graph here shows a bit of an overview of the time periods that we cover for different cities, depending on when the war ends and in some situation when renewed war breaks out. And across these 20 cities, we have coded a bit over 2,500 events of violence that is explicitly related to the preceding war. And we geocode these events with high precision because one of the key things that we are interested in is analyzing the spatial patterns of violence within cities. And these events of violence have, according to our best estimates, led to nearly 2,000 deaths and over 15,000 injuries. And among the things that we find when we analyze this data is that, in line with a lot of the existing literature on urban violence, levels of violence vary significantly across different cities, but also over time within cities and across space within cities. So for instance, if we zoom in on 4 of the cities that we focus on more in depth within the project, Beirut in Lebanon, Belfast in Northern Ireland, Mitrovica in Kosovo, and Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, we see quite varying patterns over time. So the left-hand axis in this graph is the number of events that we record. So again, this is kind of explicitly conflict-related violence. And the bottom axis is the number of years after the war has ended. And in all these 4 cases, there was an initial gradual decrease in violence in the immediate post-war years. But after that, violence has spiked at different times, driven by the particular forms of post-war contestation present in the given city. So for instance, in Abidjan, the largest city of Cote d'Ivoire, which is represented here by the red line, we see a major spike around 7 years after the war ended. So this coincided with the first post-war elections when the results were contested, and this can then be traced back to the main dividing line of the war. So the electoral violence here intersected with the way that urban elites from different political blocs sought to establish territorial control over different neighborhoods and informal settlements in Abidjan and claim them as their political strongholds. In Belfast, which is represented by the orange line here in this graph, we see a spike in violence around 10 years after the end of the war. And this was a year that saw repeated riots and clashes between Republicans and Loyalists in Belfast, sparked by a dispute over a Catholic school, which was located in a Protestant area of the highly segregated post-war city. So what these examples, I think, illustrate is the way that post-war urban violence is often the result of continued political conflicts that become intertwined with struggles over space in the city. And this then in turn produces different spatial patterns of violence depending on the context-specific dynamics of contestation. So the left-hand map here shows Abidjan, where post-war violence has been quite dispersed throughout the city, although certain neighborhoods have been particularly affected at certain times. And this makes sense in a context where the war was fought over who should control central political power. Although Abidjan is not the political capital, it is the most important urban center of Côte d'Ivoire and the key economic hub. So remaining contestation in Abidjan has pitted political opposition and incumbent supporters against each other, especially then around elections. But also the violence has included kind of former combatants carving out spaces of influence and control over economic activity in urban neighborhoods. On the right hand, there is a map which illustrates a slightly different pattern. So here we see a quite high concentration of violence in Mitrovica, around one key location, the main bridge over the river Ibar. So here, the war was about state formation, and it resulted in the creation of the contested state of Kosovo, wherein Mitrovica then is a divided city with a Serb-dominated north and a Kosovo-Albanian-dominated south. And in this context, the main bridge has become both a geographic node, but also, and not least, a symbolic site for those who are seeking to attack or provoke the other side. So what are the implications of these observations about continued contestation in post-war cities when it comes to organized crime and illicit economies? So I wanted to mention a few things. A first key point is that it is very often difficult to distinguish criminal violence from political conflict-related violence. So in many cases, former warring parties re-establish themselves as criminal networks in the post-war city, and pre-existing criminal actors become tangled up in the conflict-related violence. So for instance, in Belfast, paramilitary groups that fought during the war have been highly involved in sort of post-war crime, including black market activities, extortion, and drug trade. A second point is that even sort of purely criminal violence risks escalating into intergroup violence. As an example, a few years back, sort of a personal dispute in Beirut escalated into a fatal shootout, leading a Sunni Muslim leader to publicly warn against the risk of escalation in a context of high sectarian tension combined with availability of weapons. And a final point is that the post-war context presents particular challenges for policing. So the security apparatus may be fragmented, or it might be undergoing security sector reform. Trust in police among segments of the population tend to be low, not least then in some contexts where this is exacerbated by the use of police to kind of repress in the post-war context those who are in opposition to the powers that be. And although our data collection only covers violence that is explicitly connected to the war and not criminal violence in a broader sense, I think it still helps to underline the frequent connection between political and criminal violence. So while we do not explicitly code whether events of violence are related to organized crime, we did a sort of quick search in the event descriptions in our dataset, which are typically summaries of the news reports on which our coding is based. And there are some important caveats here. So the extent to which news narratives of violent events emphasize political or criminal dimensions arguably varies quite a lot across different contexts. Also, the fact that criminal actors are not mentioned in the report obviously does not mean that the event is not related to illicit economies and crime. Still, I think this kind of quick and dirty approach indicates that at least 10% of our events of conflict-related violence involve criminal actors, and likely kind of if we would explicitly look for criminal dimensions, it would be an even higher proportion. So I think I will end there. I want to thank you so much for listening. If you're interested to know more about the project and the data, you're welcome to check out the project page on Uppsala University's website. So thanks, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Thanks a lot, Emma. Joanna, over to you.
Hi, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. So after this amazing presentation from Emma, I'm gonna talk a little bit about Rio de Janeiro, my hometown, which is a city that has never experienced any civil conflict in terms of interstate wars and but we do have our conflict that is can be quite intense and quite severe. So let me share my screen. Sorry. So Rio de Janeiro is quite famous for being the marvelous city, but also by its violence. So it's a city that we have several parts of the territory that is controlled by non-state armed groups that I'm gonna explain in detail. It's a city marked by the presence of several. It's a city of 6.7 million people, where 20% of population live in very dense informal settlements that we call favelas. And I mentioned that because these favelas were initially the basis for most of the criminal groups that appear in the cities in the 80s. But nowadays they are not restrained to these areas. So these favelas started in the 80s to be roam for drug trafficking organizations, actually drug syndicates that initially we have just one in the city. And they use the networks they already were in place in favelas to sell marijuana to start to sell cocaine in the 80s. And suddenly in the late 80s, they split in another, and they started a series of turf wars in the city. So these drug syndicates are typically composed by very young people, like they were typically born in favelas. They spend most of their time there. And a particular difference from many other cities that have a lot of problems with criminal gangs is that in the case of Rio, they are super heavily armed. And there are a lot of discussion, why is that? But probably it's because we have a lot of fractionalization of the groups, but also because we have a very intense police interventions that in the city. In the 2000s, there was another different group that appears in the city, which are the police-linked militias. We call them militias groups, but they are different from what we use militias in other contexts. In the case of Rio, it's basically like police guys who started to provide like mini protection rackets, like they offer to the community, like protection service in change for, and they charge protection fees. And for like during the 2000s, a lot of people considered that this would be a good evil, like this would be an opportunity to control for the drug syndicates, and they actually did have some support from politicians, like let them work, they are helping us to control the drug dealers. Nowadays, they are considered a problem similar or bigger to the drug syndicates, but what we have in the city is a scenario with, you have parts of the city that are controlled, and I'm gonna explain what I mean by controlled by non-started armored groups. What I mean by control is that they establish a oligopoly of coercion with the state. It's not that the state is never there. Actually, one thing that is super important to emphasize in the Rio is that this is a very important city in Latin America. It's not that the state is not present in these areas. We have service of education, health, social assistance, and also we have the police. The difference that the police intermittently get into the favelas and do some police raids and then they leave. So, but it's not, I don't like when we say stateless places, it's not, the state is there, but they not have fully control of monopoly of the coercion. So these groups have a lot of power, like to threaten people, to use violence, and even to like put barricades in the streets, like, and have heavily armed people guarding the areas. It varies a lot depending on the area of the city, how openly armed they are, but they kind of control who enters and what people can do. And an important part of that is that also they control local markets. They are like, they try to establish local monopolies. Sometimes they exert economic activity, others they tell who can do that, but they try, there is a, and this, in that case, they are similar, in some sense, similar what we see in the mafias, that they really like control, they hinder competition and decide who can establish, exert economic activities there. And so, in my opinion, they do that. And the main goal of the territorial control actually is establish local monopolies of economic activities, drug syndicates mainly to sell drugs, militia groups mainly to charge protection fees, like to extort people. But what we have seen over time is that they expand a lot their portfolio. I'm going to show to you. And in both cases, we have nowadays these gangs explore, these two groups exploring several different economic activities, the militias with more intensive and more diversification, but even the drug gangs that in the past usually mainly to sell drugs are nowadays exploring internet servers, gas canisters, selling waters, or control who can sell water bottles and so on. And in order to have this territorial control, they need to have some political support, which is connections and bribes with law enforcement agents, and which is, we can think about different public agents that are involved on that, but like the police is a very key actor because they are the one that is mainly responsible for like law enforcement. But also, and another thing is there are large literature that studies criminal governance and how they impose rules and restrictions of behavior of the population. So the thing is, the city has been over this problem for more than 30 decades. It's not that the police has been very working like a lot in trying to control or combat this. And I'm gonna explain in a minute. But one of the key things when I was working in the government was trying to say, okay, what is the size of that? Has this been growing or reducing? And we didn't have any clue about it. Actually, the government didn't have any clue about it. The government does a lot of stuff all the time. And we didn't have an idea whether the problem was increasing or going down. And the problem of that is that nobody tracks statistics on this. Actually, the only one in the position to track statistics of that is the government, but they don't have any incentives for that because they don't want it to mark what is the size of the problem. So basically what I have done with a group of co-authors was to use Disque Denúncia, which is a very important crime hotline in the city, to track reports of group exercising territorial armed control. That would mean that there is armored circulation of bodyguards, surveillance and obstruction of roads, and they are mentioned that are exploiting some economic activity. A broad range of economic activities such as collection of fees, service such as electricity, gas, internet, transportation, land sales, irregular construction, illegal activities. We have a big list. I'm not going into the details to explain how we did that because in order to save time, but pretty much we have reports. We have 400,000 reports for a period, for 12-year periods that we geocoded them, and we can know by the colors are different groups. And like here in the black frontiers are the favelas, and the blue one are the neighborhoods borders. So pretty much the zoom is to show that this is not restricted to the favelas anymore, but pretty much what we did is that we aggregate some of these dots, and whenever you have several dots around that mention that there is an armed group, the name of the armed group, and they are exploring some economic activities, we would mark there is an indication that the group is there. And so when we look at the metropolitan area of the city, we see that is super broad. Okay, they are like very present in this, which is like the most urbanized areas in the city. In this west zone of the city is quite famous for being very we can only mainly see militias, but really around the bay, the Guanabara Bay, we see like they are very widespread. But something we're very interesting to see, it's how this evolved over time. So pretty much this is the graphs for the city of Rio. So pretty much they have been quite stable all over these 12 years with some variations that we cannot, due to the source of data, we cannot claim that it's like a variation, but it's pretty much, for instance, Comando Vermelho, which is still the biggest gang. It's present in 50% of the neighborhoods in Rio. And Malaysia is around 40, then go down a little bit. And what we see is an expansion for the metropolitan, to the outskirts of the city. So this is the graph that excludes the city of Rio, but which is pretty much where they could expand. But we still see militia groups and the other drug syndicate increased a lot in here 2017, 18, but also Comando Vermelho is still quite strong. I'm on time here. Sorry, I forgot to track my time, Antonio.
You have 2 minutes left if you want.
This is whatever. So what we did in this work is that Disque Denúncia also allows us to, it's a report that people provide and explain what is going on. So by doing that, we use Disque Denúncia in 2 dimensions. One is to get information about what they are reporting, which is this orange one, the light orange, and the light purple. And the other is that we use Disque Denúncia in order to run a survey. So whenever a person called Disque Denúncia, we ask them whether they could answer some questions about the community, but pretty much our aim was to understand what the type of economic activities they are exerting. So this is the colors here change by the source of the data. So pretty much what we see is that what we already know, that militias are mainly protection rackets groups, while drug syndicates mainly, all of them, pretty much all of them explore illicit drug trade. But what is important for us here is to see that militias are 1/3 of them are already selling drugs, something that they promised that they would never do. But I think there is still a difference that drug factions do sell drugs in a more openly manner, like they run overt markets. That is something that annoys a lot of the population, but it means here that there is some drug trade in militia areas, and also we start seeing the drug trade and the drug gangs also extorting people. And when we look at other markets such as cable, internet, electricity, gas canisters, we see a variation depending how we got the information. But in both cases, for instance, cable, internet, we are seeing that in 80% of the communities in the areas that mention the presence of the group, someone mentioned that they are exploring cable, internet. Gas canisters too, which is for us is mainly like you see, once you have the control territory and you understand that you can hinder competition, you can do whatever you want there, and they're going to diversify as much as they can. The last thing I would like to mention is that all this scenario doesn't mean that the police or the government's not doing nothing. Actually, we have a very active police in Rio. In Rio, we have 2 types. In Brazil, we have 2 police, the military police, who is responsible for patrolling the streets, and the civil police, who is responsible for investigation, but also carry raids sometimes when they have a warrant, they need to comply. So they have these very armored trucks, they use heavily rifles and so on. And another particular issue in Rio is that the police is super violent. In 2021, the police alone officially killed 7.8 people per 100,000 inhabitants. So we are in a scenario in Rio that the police alone is responsible for 1/3 of the murders in the city. This is the largest period we can track this information. In Rio, we see that we are experiencing lower levels of homicides since 2003, but police killings have not decreased over time. Actually, there is the only period that they were reduced. It's here that it's the period of pacifying police units that we have major decreasing homicides, followed by decreasing police killings. So this was the only period in Rio that we are able to reduce both things. In the last years, there was a reduction in homicides and an increase in police killings. I'm not saying that one causes the others, but everything that happens made the two going in different directions. And so what I think, so I'm gonna stop here, but what I want to emphasize is that our data shows that most of the policies that governments have pursued so far have been very inefficient in curbing the expansion of these groups. There is an indication that violence has decreased over time, but economic outreach has increased. And so this criminal enterprise that we call territorial criminal is the price revenue is no longer highly dependent on illicit drug trade. They do have a comparative advantage to explore any market that provision require local presence and have limited supply. And another thing that I think it's very important to emphasize when you are discussing how to curb this group is that they are not parallel orders or a consequence of absent state. The survival and growth of the independent state policies and interactions with state agents. And I think we need to put that in the center of the discussion when we want to discuss how to curb these groups. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Joanna. So one thing that I should highlight to our audience is that rather unexpectedly, we ended up having a deep dive on Rio because Andrea, who will speak next, is also, has researched Rio in depth and will talk about the drug trafficking dynamics and characteristics. But I think that's a good thing because it's sort of a case study on a city that has been very prominent in the study of urban violence, and in many ways has, due to the things that Joanna mentioned and the incredible, if that's the right word, visibility and violence and level of armament that the armed groups possess. So with that, Andrea, it's over to you. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Antonio, for this presentation. Thanks to Emma and Joanna for their presentations before. I will try to be short, even though, it's always kind of a challenge for academics, but, I will try my best also because, of course, Santiago was supposed to be here. I was really looking forward to hear his talk, but unfortunately he cannot. So the first thing that I want to say is, well, thanks to Antonio for organizing this panel and how I'm happy about this panel being organized. As Antonio mentioned, I am one of the co-coordinators of the Urban Violence Research Network, and exploring these issues is what we do and what we encourage. So, of course, it's for people like Antonio to go out there, and seek the contribution of experts from different fields and on different cases. And these discussion about urban violence and about the different linkages and the different aspects of these problems, which, as Emma has shown, can be very long-standing and can be very complicated to assess. It's something that we carry out. So, I think this panel is pretty important. What I will try to do is, Joanna's presentation was really good, but I'm not surprised. And she really brought up quite a lot of material. I will try to, as Antonio said, my research is based on Rio de Janeiro, but I will try to tease out some of the things that we see in the case of Rio de Janeiro, then probably speak about, broader issues, broader problems with one of the things that Joanna mentioned towards the end, curtailing urban violence, curtailing especially curbing the power and the negative consequences, such as the violence, again, of these armed groups, which indeed, in the case of Rio, they tend to be criminal in nature. But then when you talk about those police militias, it starts straddling the border between what is political, what is criminal. And I think this is one of the key takeaways that I want to really get through is how urban violence itself, the idea, really challenges any kind of pretense to draw nice boundaries between ideas, concepts, fields, and so on. It's really complicated. It's really messed up. That's a short of it. We need to understand those linkages between different fields, between different economies, between different basically types of issues, to really understand how the resilience of these criminal groups come up. And regarding, cities and illicit economies, John already mentioned these linkages between different types of economic activities. And what I would also add, of course, is how these economic activities really straddle the border between legal and illegal. So, of course, the idea of extortion rackets and the drug trade and so on, these are your classic idea of illegal economic activity. But then we know that these groups, especially some police militias, are involved in illegal construction activities, and of course that's illegal because they don't go to the local town, like local council, asking for a license to build. But this is an activity that is not illegal in itself. It's just not permitted. And of course we have the issue of the expansion of the basically informal transport businesses and activities, which is something that a lot of people in these informal settlements, especially those who live outside of the main centers of economic activity, they rely on. So it really impacts their mobility. But these things, Joanna already mentioned. A few other links that we see in the case of Rio are, for example, and that impact the resilience of these groups and contributes really to the resilience of these groups, is, for example, the link between jail side, so to speak, and city side. The idea that there is a link between the presence of these groups in prisons and the presence of these groups outside, because just as these groups have territorial control over a vast amount of the city, and as Joanna said, it used to be just, the informal settlements of favelas, but now, they have expanded it in some cases much beyond them. Well, these groups were, especially the gangs, especially the drug dealing gangs, were born in prisons. So actually, that was possibly, my PhD, wrote a history of these gangs. That was most likely the first big jump, first big increase in resilience. Of course, and we see these in a lot of other cases in other parts of Brazil. We have the case of the first command with capital, the PCC in Sao Paulo, most famously, which is now most likely one of the most dangerous, not the most dangerous criminal group in South America. Once you achieve, as a criminal group, territorial control over these different types of territory, you have increased your resilience. You have become more adaptable to different types of environments. We can see the prison, by the way, as an urban environment, because of course it's a built-in environment. I know some people may criticize me for that, but it's a built-in environment that sees, just, in these cases, partial control by the state, complicated service provision as well. But once you expand as a criminal group outside of just one type of territory, you are increasing your resilience by, profiting from different economic opportunities and different, of course, types of territorial governance, in those two types of areas, and especially, of course, by extracting resources by those two types of populations, the inmates and the local residents. So, of course, this is already a first link between two things. And I think prisons tend to be disregarded as part of a city, also because, people tend to, put them as far away from the cities as possible, but those linkages are there. The link between police and gangs is also pretty important. This is something that is very difficult to research, I would say, probably in any case. So not just in the case of Rio, but of course, because of course, investigating police corruption, it's pretty complicated, and researching police corruption depends on the existence, for example, of strong either civil society institutions or police institutions that can crack down, or at least, reveal evidence of that. But some preliminary research that are run by collecting newspaper reports of those issues show a quite diverse range of arrangements that can exist between police forces and gangs. These arrangements tend to involve the fact that I've been invited, just recently means that I couldn't come up, with like slides, unfortunately for these occasions. But of course, like what we see from newspaper reports is a pretty diverse range of arrangements that go from very, kind of short-lived arrangements where police forces may kidnap, basically, well, arrest, so to speak, kidnap members of local gangs and basically kidnap for ransom, to, what Angelica Duran Martinez would term, and other colleagues, of course, state-sponsored protection racket. So the idea that local police forces, and sometimes it tends to be police officers on the ground, because of course they are the ones with the most amount of contact with local criminal groups, they will protect criminal activities through regular payments. And, these arrangements, also like these different types of arrangements between police and gangs can coexist. So the same local police force who requires a regular protection payment, if that protection payment is not coming, may kidnap one member of the gang, or may carry out some of those police operations that Joanna mentioned that tend to be so lethal, that could also be part, of course, of reinstating control, or rather reinstating their role in protecting local illegal activities. And perhaps maybe I have a few minutes for another link that is pretty important in this case. It's, of course, a link between different areas of the city. Of course, as we know, criminology 101, crime is opportunistic, takes advantage of any loophole that is available. So, of course, researchers have shown, of course, that there is quite a lot of mobility right now as compared to 20 years ago between members of local gangs who could go into migrate to different parts of the city, depending on where allied gangs are based in, and even links between different parts of the country by profiting, of course, from the presence of different police forces in different states. Brazil is a federal country, so of course, in the case of Brazil, police forces tend to be state police forces. There is a federal police force, but that has a more limited scope, remit of action. And so we have seen, of course, in the past few years, the presence of groups from other parts of Brazil, especially from the Amazonia part of Brazil, states like Amazonas, Pará, in Rio de Janeiro, and the opposite. These, all these links, all these linkages, all these opportunistic moves by criminal groups in this case, I'm pretty sure you can draw parallels with the research that, for example, Antonio has carried out, comparing different cities and the involvement of criminal groups and political groups in illicit economies therein. These are very important links that tend to be disregarded by policymakers and security forces in most cases. And they by increasing the resilience, they fuel the violence that goes on. In the case of Rio, the territorial control that Joanna mentioned is centered around trying to assert a monopoly, not only of the means of force, but as she explained, about economic activities. And these fuels armed rivalry between gangs, which is what I'm looking at right now, trying to understand whether these local turf wars are actually effective in helping these groups to establish their own territorial control over these neighborhoods. I'm not sure how much time do I have left, Antonio. I don't want to go over.
Just under 1 minute left.
I say that I can finish here and leave the floor to Martin. Hopefully this is helpful for the general discussion, and thanks again for organizing this.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you very much. That was very helpful. Martin, we'll move now, pivot to a very different geography, which is also interesting personally for me, because I used to live in Rio de Janeiro and I moved to the UK, which is where your charity and your work is based. And it's a very different type of urban violence, but I have actually witnessed, not witnessed, but I have seen urban violence very close to my place and my neighborhoods here in London, and I see the topic coming up quite frequently in the news as well. Here the violence is more centered on knife crime. Firearms is not so common in the UK as they are in the Americas. But it is a very prominent and growing, I think, public policy and public problem here as well. So over to you, and I'm really, we're really interested in hearing about your experience with the Empire Fighting Chance, the trajectory and the ideas, and also your views on how violence prevention is possible, and especially from a civil society sort of NGO sort of background.
I've got some facts to follow. I'm going to talk a little bit about the context, how we started or how I started the charity and that kind of stuff we're seeing. First thing I'll say is that we're based in Bristol, which is the southwest of England. So in the context, Bristol is a very wealthy area, but a massively fractured city. So alongside that wealth, it's a huge amount of poverty. Sadly, Bristol has the lowest social mobility of any of the major UK cities. So if you're born poor in Bristol, you're almost certainly going to die poor in Bristol. And it's also, ironically, the 7th worst place in the UK to be born black. It was one of the first cities where the migrants from the Caribbean settled after the Windrush generation. But you'd argue they haven't really had the opportunities, and life hasn't moved on as much as it should have been in the city for them. For us, started Empire by accident. I used to be an analyst for an investment company, and I ran a boxing club in my spare time. One Friday night in 2006, when I was in the gym early, I looked out the window and I saw two young men that we vaguely knew dealing drugs. And for reasons that I don't think either of us knew at the time, my co-founder Jamie and I went out and said to them, look, this has to stop. We had a whole conversation about nobody cares, there's nothing for us to do, we're sort of lost, and we dragged them back into the gym, if I'm honest. We did a session with them. He said, the gym's yours, you come back anytime you want, for free, you can claim. On the Monday, they came with a couple of friends, the Tuesday, a couple more, and then within 4 or 5 weeks, we had 50 young people coming 5 days a week. And if I'm honest, we were thinking, what are we going to do? So we were trying to juggle 2 days each and flip a coin for day 3. And that went on for months, and we were happy with that. Truthfully, all we wanted to do was do a little bit for the kids 3 or 4 streets from the gym. And then 2 things happened, which I think changed everything for us. We had a young man sent to us that really struggled, and the school were going to throw him out, and we couldn't understand it. He was violent. He was always attacking teachers. And we kind of sat him down and said, what's going on? And he just said, look, I don't get maths. Rather than hold my hand up and say, I don't understand the question, I throw a table over, I shout, I swear. Everybody thinks I'm cool. And I can just leave the lesson. So we sat him down into some real basic numeracy. If you box 3 rounds and each round was 2 minutes, how many minutes have you boxed, to try and keep his confidence and keep him in school? And at the same time, we had a young man sent to us that had obvious mental health issues. I rang the school. I said, look, he's not naughty, he's just not well. They said, well, we don't really want him in school. We don't know what to do. Can you have him? I rang statutory mental health services, and I had a whole conversation about the fact that he wasn't at crisis point. He couldn't access any support whatsoever. And had he been at crisis point, he would have had to wait a minimum of 12 months. I think now it's something like 24 months. And that was a big shock. And from there on in, we started to understand and look at why young people came to the gym, and then what we could do to make a lasting change. So how could we make a difference? We didn't want to do something that was tokenistic. It needed to make a lasting difference. We started to build programs where we used our credibility as boxers combined with psychologists and therapists to support young people. Our work also includes quite a bit of what I would call gang extraction, gang engagement programs, as well as street violence interruption work. We also run this thing called boxing therapy, which I know sounds a bit odd, but young people would come to us and would not access therapeutic services. So we qualified therapists, young therapists who looked the part in the gym. They engage the young people through all our programs of non-contact, so through non-contact boxing training, and then we start to deliver therapeutic services. If I'm honest, was us for 6 years. No ambition, no plan, just doing a little bit of work. And in 2013, we decided we were going to become a charity. Since then, we've grown massively. We work directly with about 5,000 young people a year across Bristol and out in South Wales. We also have trained a number of partners across the UK. and they currently support about 7,000 young people. So currently our combined program works with about 12,000 young people a year across the United Kingdom. We in Bristol are working with those that are involved, I suppose we'd call it crudely organised street violence. Most of this violence is driven by postcode rather than economic reasons, with two main gangs dominating most of the violence. The drug trade is prevalent, but it's not exceptionally profitable. Most of the kids we deal with, it's about survival, it's about paying for rent, it's about paying for gas and electric, it's about buying food. It's not about luxury. They're surviving through the drug trade, they're definitely not thriving. As Antonio said, for us, knives are a big issue. Well, knives, swords and machetes basically are a big issue. Guns are rare, they're obtainable relatively easily in the city, but they're not used. Knife crime is our biggest issue. We're seeing a massive increase in serious incidents. Our location, we straddle the two communities that are most affected by both the lethal and non-lethal violence. And we had 3 people that we were recently that have been murdered within gang violence. 2 close together in a series of retaliatory actions. These retaliatory actions, they're increasing. Wherever you go, young people now won't access healthcare because if they go to a hospital, they get reported for having knife wounds. So statistics are not accurate, and they're trying to self-treat, self-medicate. The problem is any kind of visible injury or bandage is a sign of celebration for the attacker, and it's also seen as a sign of weakness for the victim. So we've got young people that have been knifed, sometimes quite nastily, that are trying to self-treat their wounds rather than 1, show weakness, or 2, get reported to the police or the hospital. I've also spoken recently to some people from the local authority and the police, where there is an acknowledgement that this is nearly out of control. It's very, very difficult to stop them carrying knives. And the numbers are going up. More young people are being stopped, more young people are being stabbed, but the knife crime and the carrying of knives has not been reduced. And interestingly, about 35% of our attendees are female. Though not all related to violence, a increasing number are. We're seeing more young women that are involved in physical attacks. We're seeing more young women involved in setting up males. But also what's really difficult for the young, especially the young ladies and the young women of the neighbourhoods, is that the gangs almost feel like they own them. So a young girl could talk to somebody from a different postcode, and then they start getting messages saying, look, watch your back, you've crossed the line, you're going to get hurt, you're going to get cut. So even if you've got no gang relation activity at all and you're not involved in criminal activity or a gang, if as a young woman you're seen talking to somebody from a different neighbourhood, you start getting threatened or attacked. Every interaction they get in those communities is potentially life-threatening or dangerous. Civil societies, and I'm going to catch that a little bit because that's what I know. I think I could sum it up in 3 words: legitimacy and trust. One of the most important things we have as an organisation is we are legitimacy in the community, and we have trust. Young people trust us, they know we're there. We're not part of an institution, we're not part of the police force, we're not part of somebody that they feel would report them or potentially has oppressed them or committed some kind of state-related violence and oppression over the last few years. It's also accessible, and I think accessibility is hugely important and one of our great strengths. We're based in the community, we have a very low cost point. Anybody who uses the charity doesn't ever have to pay for sessions, and somebody wants to come in box could come in box for a very little nominal amount. Even if they can't afford it, they can still train. I'd also say boxing clubs probably exist in almost every community in the world. You might not have soccer clubs, rugby clubs, cricket, rowing, but you have a boxing club. So that boxing club is always an integral part of a community. It's trusted. Nobody's ever embarrassed to be in a boxing gym. One of the really great strengths of our therapy is people will go, I'm not going to go to therapy. They say, I'm going to the gym, I'm going to the boxing gym. And as a result, they're able to access something that's safe, can benefit them. We give them jobs, we relocate them in different areas of the country if we need to. But they're in an environment where they don't feel embarrassed, and nobody will ever question their presence in the gym. And sort of finally, I suppose, for us, we use the sport to build relationships. It's a really easy way of engaging. Once we can do that, they can access the psychological help. We have recently undergone some work with the youth justice, where young men who were arrested for violent behaviour were put on one of 3 programs through the courts. Anybody that came to us was over 3 times less likely to offend than any other program they run. And the last cohort we ran 4 cohorts, and 85% of those young people that were sent to us did not reoffend. So we're able to stop violence escalating through our relationships, and honestly, we're able to stop people reoffending. And actually, at the very early stages, we're able to engage them before this behaviour becomes particularly violent. And I think that's why civil society is so uniquely placed to help.
Thanks a lot, Martin. That was very, very illuminating of the ways that this issue is tackled at the grassroots. And Martin ended our this round of comments on some ideas and some personal experience on how to tackle the problem of urban violence. And it's the question that I want to pose to the panel. I encourage our participants to pose questions via the Q&A function, and we will read them here. But I'll start with a question to all of you, which is also derived from my research experience in Rio de Janeiro, where the police, as has been mentioned so often in our presentations, has been part of the problem in many ways, and the repressive security policies based on police raids and the use of force to engage criminal groups, often resulting in firefights, gunfights in densely populated areas, has been going on for so long. And I wanted to pick the brains of Joanna and Andrea on why do you think that this response has been going on for so long. And Joanna mentioned the pacification strategy, which greatly reduced for a moment the homicides. And perhaps for our audience that is not familiar with the pacification strategy, to talk a little bit about it and why and its philosophy of sort of combining security and development policies. For Emma, I was wondering, in countries transitioning from armed conflict where states are quite fragile and control can be quite, and capacities, bureaucratic capacities can be so low. What is the role of national governments and international, let's say, the famous international community that doesn't exist, but the role of international organizations and donors and international development agencies in tackling urban forms of violence? Is it that they need to engage with local governments, or they need to adopt urban sort of lenses and methods to understand these problems? So just some of the questions are going through my mind. And to Martin, how do you evaluate the response by the UK government, and who is leading responses and preventative, hopefully, approaches towards this violence? Local governments, national government. How do you see this interaction between civil society, such as yourself, with government? So perhaps if we can start with the same order, if that's okay, Emma.
All right, thank you for the question. I think it's a difficult one for me to answer because it's not something that I have directly been researching. But I mean, I know it varies, I think, a lot between different contexts. So I would emphasize that, for instance, we see a very different dynamic in cases where like a government has won the wars. Think about Sri Lanka, for instance, where there's sort of high state capacity and high repressive violence, compared to a situation like in Mitrovica, where essentially kind of peace was kept quite fiercely by international forces. What I would say is that I think you're right in, I mean, your question you ask, and I think quite rightly, how such strategies. So if we're thinking about security sector reform and kind of international operations in post-war context and so on, do they need to adopt urban lenses? And I would definitely answer that question in the affirmative. And I think that is maybe sometimes done, but probably not to the extent that it needs to be, because I think that there's often not enough maybe of an understanding of like the specific urban context. So like, what are the specific symbolic sites, and what are the specific patterns of territorial control and things like that, that such operations would need to be aware of. I also think, and I mean, I think this is the big dilemma, right? What a lot of the presentations talk about is this issue of trust. How do you build or rebuild trust in that type of context? And I mean, it's difficult to do And then this gets at the question of how does international community engage with the state government. I mean, at some point you will need to have a national kind of police and security apparatus that enjoys the trust of the population. But how do you get from a situation of, you know, more or less kind of peacekeeping to that situation? I think that's a very common challenge. And yeah, maybe I should just hand over to the other speakers to maybe reflect on kind of more nuanced aspects of that question.
Joanna.
Okay, thank you for Antonio and all these wonderful presentations. I think the first thing you need to bear in mind is that it's extremely difficult to control any organized criminal group. And another thing, I think it's different, like from when you think about a civil conflict, like an interstate war, there is no end on its own. What we can aim is to control organized crime, it's probably never gonna end. And I think this is something that we need to bear in mind when we think about what is the goal of the government, what the government is doing. Most of the time, what it's doing is like trying to arrest a kingpin, and this is not going to change anything. They're going to be replaced quite easy. And I think the governments do not put a lot of time like thinking what are the goal. And we talk a lot in Brazil, like in the discussion, like we hear a lot of specialists telling, we need more intelligence. I think the right word we need is like a strategy in a way we talk about like war in the same, what are you weighing, like how we can control the total problem and not only a particular part of the territory. And which is, so the pacifiance policy units, what was a very successful policy in Rio in the first 5 years, I think it needs to be recognized as the only moment in our history that the government decided to do something that the end was not to end drug dealing, that is never going to end, but really like regain the monopoly of the government, of the monopoly of power by the government, and trying to reduce lethal violence and shootings across. So I think this is the objective we should pursue. But what the government has done was like, so I think first we did a lot of, so the key difference, it was to, instead of doing a lot of police raids, the police would go there and would stay with new recruits. And this was super successful in the first 4 or 5 years, measured by like major reduction in crimes, but it was not a sustainable strategy. First of all, we cannot have this type of military level of people in the slums for so long. It's very unsustainable in financial terms, but also in terms of like what would be the second step for that. And although we think about like, oh, we need some social policy, we didn't have in practice. And we didn't have because the government didn't put a lot of attention, but I think we need also to recognize that we do not know what is social policy for these areas, because it's not about supplying schools. The schools are there. Like, it's what you're going to do with schools, what you're going to do in the social projects, such as the one Martin is talking about. I think we need to start to discuss social policies like for youth at risk, highly involved and prone to get involved in violence problems and crime problems. This is a typical of social programs that we do not have, at least the government. I bet there are a lot of NGOs that have a lot of technology how to deal with that. But I have never heard about like any government policy to try to expand and scale up amazing initiatives that we have conducted by NGOs that are more able to think deeply about like what the root of the problem and how we could deal with that. But summarizing what I just said, I think we need 2 specific blocks in order like two avenues of work here. One is that from the law enforcement agencies, is start to rethink about what are the goals and what they can in practice achieve in order to control and reduce both violence, but also profitability of these gangs. And the other line of work is like working with NGOs, grassroots organizations that know the field, know the people, in order to really think better on innovations and policies that can help really prevent youth violence. Thanks.
Andrea.
I mean, I totally agree with what Joanna just said. I will just maybe, you know, and I especially agree with the issue about strategy. I think sometimes, you know, there is this idea that just by, you know, showing money through social programs, the problem will solve itself. No, you need to have a clear idea of what you want to achieve. And I would say from my point of view, a key strategy, and I think this probably applies to, you know, quite a few different cases, recruitment, cutting recruitment into criminal groups, getting with, you know, works like the charity that Martin, you know, of course, here represents, and like so many charities in the case of Rio, who try to get people out. And, I mean, you may have seen the article on Science by Rafael Preto Curiel, Gianmaria Campanelli, and Alejandro Hope, making this point regarding cartels in Mexico after they try to basically make an estimate of how many people work for the cartels in Mexico. And they say cutting recruitment is the only way to curtail violence. And I agree, like what some of these charities are doing really well is that, and so that should be encouraged, that should be made into a priority. I will add a couple of things very shortly. One, I think the police can be lethal, brutal, and so on, because they can. Tight oversight over the police and institutions inside the police or outside, they can get denounces from the population and crack down on corruption. This is essential to, you know, carve down violence as well, you know, as creating that trust. And also, when we look at lethality, we need to see the other side of the coin. There's lethality on one side and corruption on the other. You can't understand the issue of police operations in Rio without looking at both. Yes, there is the lethality, yes, there's the violence, but there's also the exchange of money that goes on sometimes at the same time, and those two are linked.
Martin.
Thanks. Actually, I'll start with a friend of mine, and I suspect somebody that a lot of you may know, Santiago Rocha from Medellin, often says cities by their people, but they're very often the last ones to be consulted when we're making changes or policy. In the UK, what I would say is the local government, so your city government, have a vested interest in making the city better, but they have limited budgets and very little power. I'd also say that central government has probably caused the upsurge in violence by their policies, which have been extremely oppressive. We have cut services, we have cut preventative services to the bone, we have cut police numbers, we've reduced budgets to schools, we've removed assets from communities. We are the most centralized country in Europe. So it is no surprise that we've taken those things from a community that our violence goes up. So, you know, they're harming the UK, not making it safer. I think it is a tricky one. There is preventative stuff. It's not really invested in. It doesn't necessarily make a great headline for a politician. So there may be a tokenism about it, but we still keep and trade on this law and order approach. We must arrest people. We must lock them up forever. We must arrest. We must lock them up forever. I've never seen anything that suggests that we can arrest this violence or violence out of existence. I've just not seen it. I've seen lots of stuff where I've spoken to when we can educate, we can engage, we can stop supply chains to gangs by cutting off recruitment, we can increase knowledge of violence and stop that sort of stuff happening. But we can't arrest ourselves out, but it doesn't seem to be a good headline. I know everybody knows of the Glasgow model, which has been relatively successful, but I wouldn't say that's a common approach in the UK. It's not an approach we use. And also, something that really surprised me until I came into this sector is that the violence prevention strategies are actually quite fractious. So people who are supposed to be reducing violence seem to spend most of their time arguing about the best way to reduce violence and not looking at involving those that are either doing the work or might have first-hand knowledge of it. So to sum it up, I think city governments have their hands tied. National governments have caused a lot of these problems, and the violence prevention work is never done in a way that includes those that can actually make the biggest difference.
Thanks. We have 5 minutes left. I wanted to use this to pick the brain of Emma on something that the Global Initiative is doing work on, which is the linkage between urbanization and security, but also specifically, of course, on organized crime. And there used to be, the famous Chicago School of sociologists arguing that urbanization leads to more violence, and then that, of course, is now understood as oversimplification. But there is a very, I think, justifiable sense that urbanization leads to pressures for urban management, especially in areas that are currently urbanizing extremely fast, such as sub-Saharan Africa, which is also where a lot of the conflicts that in general are taking place right now, and especially the ones that you study, Emma. So what is your sense about the linkage between urbanization and urban violence? Is there a linkage of these pressures on local governments and public services, and with sufficient jobs, are these facilitators or accelerators of violence in cities?
Thanks. I think that's a really interesting question, and I mean, as you point out, I think that there has been, and I think it's still there, this kind of alarmist idea that urbanization leads to chaos and violence, but that has largely been kind of disproven, or we know that it's more complicated than that, and it leads to different outcomes. But you can still, I mean, from kind of a theoretical side, you can still see how the pressures of urbanization, very rapid urbanization in contexts where it's not kind of associated with simultaneous sort of increase in provision of opportunities, of housing, of services, and so on, you can see how that would create kind of a possible foundation for violence, both for criminal violence and also for political violence. I think one can approach this problem from different perspectives. I think one perspective is that these challenges in themselves is something that we should care about, whether or not they kind of turn into high levels of violence. But another is to kind of try to focus in on what are the specific conditional factors then that mean that this, under some conditions, does lead to violence. We recently did sort of a literature overview of kind of recent studies in the past few years that actually look at this question. So kind of what are the factors that can mediate this link? And some of the key things that we found are sort of highlighted as within the broader literature is urban planning. So planners do have capable urban planning together with sufficient resources mean that city governors can to some extent mitigate some of these pressures and provide services to a growing urban population, or reduce the stress that this creates. Another thing is exactly this thing that we have been talking about with the police and kind of security institutions. So I mean, the risk of violence increases if the police is treating different communities differently, and repressive policing is something that the research shows increases violence. So, and then research is more mixed about kind of how useful approaches like community policing, like more community-oriented policing, is in mitigating and kind of building trust. Often that type of reforms are implemented when trust is already so low that it's really difficult to kind of overcome. But that's one. But this issue of restraining use of force by police, for instance, seems to be something that can actually work. And then a final thing that I think really kind of resonates with what Joanna and Andrea and Martin have all been saying is that there is ample evidence in the research of kind of how effective everyday kind of initiatives for coexistence, bottom-up civil society initiatives and so on can be. And I think there's a challenge there as well in, I mean, kind of a balance that has to be struck between kind of when those should be supported, but when they risk becoming co-opted. So I think that's also kind of an interesting question. Like when does the bottom-up initiative stop working because it has become a top-down initiative? So I think that's maybe an interesting question to continue to explore. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I think the time is up, as our producers have just informed me, and the clock as well. So thank you very much to our speakers and to our participants for your time and your thoughts. I encourage you to get in touch with us via the Global Initiative website, via the Urban Violence Research Network, and look up our amazing speakers online to get involved in this